But thank you very much for coming along. So I'm Matthew Davis. I'm an associate professor at the Business School here in Leeds. I'm going to talk a little bit, well, I'm going to talk a lot this evening about hybrid working and the future workplace, drawing on a series of research that we've been conducting with colleagues at the university. So, agenda for this evening. So we might go forward and a bit quicker through some bits than others, but this is generally what we're doing. A little bit of context setting, bit of background. I'm going to start off then in terms of thinking about what we actually mean by hybrid working, maybe just challenging a little bit about our conceptions on this. Then I'm going to share some data that we have, and I'll tell you a bit more about where that's come from, about some of the implications that we're seeing playing out of hybrid working, what that might mean for requirements for the future office, future ways of working. Then I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about a systems view on this. And Vicky, who I saw on the call, won't be surprised to be talking a bit about socio-technical systems thinking. That's a mindset I have for a lot of problems. I think it's really useful when we're talking about hybrid working and what the implications are of this big change that we're living through. Then I'm going to go in depth a little bit. A paper we had published a few months ago that's looking at location autonomy, talking a bit more about why we should care about this. And then I'll finish up with some reflections. And I promise that however this unfolds, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. If anything I'm talking about is of interest, and I hope some of it will be, I'll refer you to some reports that are freely accessible, paper at the end as well that you can download for free if you want to dive into some more the depth of some of the data, some of the findings that I'm talking about. So hopefully that sounds okay. Drop a note in the chat if there's things that come to mind as we're going through. Pop it in the chat. I'll try and fish those out or pick up on them if I can as we go as well. Yeah, drop a note in as well if anything happens with video or audio as well. It's not always obvious on this side. Okay, so we'll be really brief on this. So who am I? I'm Matt Davis. I'm an associate professor in organizational psychology at the University of Leeds. I work in the business school, in the management department, and I'm part of the program team for our MSc in organizational psychology and business. So we've got about 80 students or so on the course this year. So if you're looking for good psychologists who are coming out of their grad studies at any point, come and have a chat to us in Leeds. My research in general, I'm really interested in the built environment, so how people interact with the world around them, particularly the design of office space, increasingly technology as well. I've also got a keen interest in environmental sustainability and CSR as well. With most of this, I bring a socio-technical mindset, and I'll talk a bit about that in a bit. I get really excited by getting out, and particularly getting out of the university. So work a lot with corporate partners, public sector, and other local organizations as well. And I've been fortunate the last few years that people have been really interested in this topic, and various bits of research have been featured in international media. So where are we coming from then? I'm going to ask you to just take your mind back at the start to the early days of COVID-19, if you can do. And I think for most people, what was this sudden shock of being prevented from going into the office and really having their conceptions of what it meant to go to work challenged. And in quite a fundamental way, really, for people who'd never had the experience of home working before, hadn't really questioned how you go about doing your work. It's just, I go to the office and that's where I sit at the desk I've always been at. And we've still been living through this kind of, I guess, initially this trauma and then this sense of possibility. And then what I think we're probably now in, which is much more a negotiation of what the new normal or just, I guess, hybrid work, future work looks like. But it's been quite a roller coaster. And I think we forget how far we've come, how quickly and how much is still in flux. And hopefully some of what I share tonight will help in terms of unpicking a little bit of this. So this is the last good data that we've really got, I think, from the ONS. So this is their labour force survey last year. If you've been reading any of the economics news and so on, you'll know there's problems with this survey now. So the data is a little less forthcoming. But the last good stats on this, we've shown that we're up to now 28% of the UK workforce who report hybrid working. That's their work arrangement. And if you think about this, before the pandemic, we didn't even ask the question in this survey whether you hybrid work. It wasn't a term we were using. We asked people if they regularly worked from home or they fully worked from home, but we didn't use terms like hybrid working at all. It was much more binary. So at the point now, 28% of the workforce hybrid work, 16% are fully home working, and then we've got 44% professional workers hybrid work. That's a big proportion of professional class knowledge workers who are in this arrangement, but it's still significant in terms of administrative workers as well. So this is rapidly becoming the common kind of work experience for many. We still don't know a whole lot around the implications of it. And just by contrast, we think immediately before the pandemic, 12.3% of the workforce were regularly working from home at least some of the time. They'd had that experience. So that's a huge shift. So we're really intrigued by this as we're going through the pandemic and wanted to understand, well, what are the longer term implications going to be of this shift? And we were lucky enough to win funding from the Economic and Social Research Council. If anybody is connected to the ESRC or you come across somebody from the ESRC, be really grateful if you mention our project and said you'd like to. It might help us get more funding going forwards. But we put together a consortium of public and private sector organizations who had colleagues coming back to hybrid work environments. A lot were investing in changing their offices as well. And we were using that as an opportunity to gather data in a range of ways to understand, okay, what does it mean in terms of the implications of hybrid working on people's experience of work, their interaction with others? What does this mean for the design of physical space going forwards? So we're working a lot with estates, companies, designers and others, IT, multidisciplinary design team and project team. So myself, other psychologists, ergonomists, information systems specialists and engineers as well. So we're doing interviews, stakeholder interviews, industry workshops, UK-wide office worker snapshot surveys to get a pulse check of where people are. Employee diary studies, I'll talk a bit more about this, but asking people twice a day over a few week periods where they were, what they were doing, what spaces they were in, how they were feeling and behaving. Got about 10,000 data points from that. Social network analysis, looking at floor plans and where people were and their patterns of interactions within their offices. Longitudinal interviews with employees as well. So we've got a really interesting, rich data set, and I'm going to highlight some bits as we go through. There's lots more on this in the reports that I'll flag at the end. So the first thing that I wanted to do was just to take a step back a second. Ask you to reflect on what hybrid working means for you. And also just to maybe just spend a moment and just think in terms of whether that's necessarily the same as what your colleagues might think hybrid working is, or what your colleagues or competitors in other organizations might think hybrid working is. And I say that because one of the things that came through really quickly and really clearly in the interviews we did initially with employees in a range of industries, but kind of consistently since then in other projects, has been how varied this term is being applied in companies, but also the mental models that people have developed of what hybrid working is. So as I said, we didn't use this term really before the pandemic. It came through, people formed their own ideas of what it means to hybrid work, often where they had a lot of opportunity to design that themselves. So we found this way of trying to conceptualize hybrid work really useful, working with clients, talking with employees, challenging them to think what they really mean when they talk about hybrid work. And that's important because we see a lot of friction within teams, within departments, organizations, where people have different ideas and expectations of this work arrangement and what they can expect from others and what they can expect from their line managers, from their organizations. So it's really important to have that common understanding. And I think that often isn't happening as much as it should. So we see kind of hybrid working as kind of, and this is a simplification, but kind of a function of the degree of choice that workers have over when to work, as well as where to work. And often when you get into interviews, get into discussion, we find that people very quickly are mixing these two things together. And it's really difficult to talk about hybrid without kind of acknowledging that. So we think about these things, so four key areas. So free hybrids, we think that's probably classically the likes of academics, other professionals who have a high degree of autonomy, both over when they work. So you don't necessarily work fixed hours. You're not so dependent on others that you have to work shifts or hand over kind of pieces of project work. You have a high degree of autonomy over that, but also where you work. And often organizations won't mind where you work, when you work, as long as you're delivering and kind of work is being output. And I guess early on in the discussions around hybrid, that's often what people were talking about, this high autonomy, high control over how and where we work and when we work. But then classically, we've seen much more then of what we might call timeless hybrid. So this is where people have a lot of choice over when to work. So again, you might be relatively independent in your role, not reliant on others particularly, but actually less choice over where you work. Now that might be because of the technology you're using, the data you're accessing means that you have to work from the office or a client site quite often. It might be actually that you're rotated or shifted to work because of the nature of service delivery, covering customer care and so on. It may also be that actually your access to an office is rationed because your firm has downsized the amount of office space they have. But there's constraints over the where to work that means that your experience of hybrid is a little bit different. The flip side of that is nomadic hybrid. So you can expect that people have less choice over when to work. So you might be working in project teams, distributed teams, shifts to make sure that there's consistent service delivery. So you might have little choice over that, but actually the firm may not care where you work from, as long as you've got your device so you can log on. Often that's kind of characteristic of nomadic hybrids. And often we think about that in the newspapers when we see the photos of hybrid workers in a hammock on a beach. Often we think nomadic hybrid in that sense. And then the group, just want to highlight, because I think they often get neglected a lot in the discussions over what hybrid is and maybe the implications of this work arrangement, are what we'd term fixed hybrid workers. So people actually with very little autonomy over either when or where to work. So they may be being rotated on particular shifts. They may be being told exactly where they have to work. So they might have set days. They're being told they have to come into the office, maybe told when they have to work from home. And in the work that we've done, that's pretty problematic where that is an arrangement that shifts week to week. So particularly we think about childcare, maybe kind of other dependencies you might have, organizing social commitments and so on. Actually, that level of uncertainty and lack of control can be much more challenging than having a very traditional 5-day-a-week kind of set pattern in an office or full home working. So it's just to ask you to reflect on the assumptions we might have about hybrid, about whether it's always a liberating experience or a positive experience, because actually the arrangements differ remarkably between firms, but also within organizations, depending on role, job level, and management style as well. And where this kind of isn't open, it isn't explicit, it can lead to frictions and conflict. A couple of other things I want to flag them. So thinking about how far we've come. So this is data from our cross-industry survey that we ran over about 18 months or so. And the last data was about a year or so ago that we gathered in. So it's a little bit out of date, but it's still, I think, relatively reflected given other industry data I've seen. Now, I think it's interesting to see actually how settled people's preferences have become. And we can see that in terms of some of the newspaper articles around the difficulty encouraging people back to the office. So our data has shown pretty consistent over that period preferences people had. So the majority, so 54% of the office workers that we were tracking, their ideal preference for how they wanted to work going forwards was a hybrid pattern. That's probably not a surprise. I think what's really interesting is how entrenched the other two views have become, though. So we've got 23%, an equal split actually, of office workers who never want to return to the office and those who wished only to work in the office. And I think, again, other data that I'm seeing, that's pretty baked in now. So I think there's an interesting challenge, I think, to organizations who are expecting to be able to reverse some of these expectations radically in terms of either repopulating offices or shifting, I think, some of the trends we found emerge. Now, I think that matters really importantly because looking at the data that we gathered from this group, there's a real issue where people's preferences are misfitting. And we might expect that as psychologists, that misfit, that kind of lack of expectation and preference to reality, that dissonance is unhelpful. So we found around half of the sample weren't working in jobs that fitted their ideal preferences. So either they're working more or less from the office than they desired. And again, we're seeing that being predictive where it was misfitting for people more likely saying they wanted to change jobs, reporting lower well-being, lower satisfaction, worse work-life balance. So I think there's a risk there for us in terms of carrying people who are being allowed to carry on in jobs that are ill-suited. Also coming from this, a couple of other things to flag up. It's interesting to see, if you think about the 2x2 that I showed of what hybrid working, different forms of hybrid working, we're seeing around 20% of workers who have very little control over either where they worked or when they worked. So talking about that group that maybe aren't having that same kind of enjoyment of flexibility, who may be finding a hybrid working actually a more stressful arrangement, might be expecting around that 20% who might be in that category. So how do we engage with them? How do we support that group? What are the challenges if we're having a diverse set of hybrid arrangements within an organization? Potentially there's winners and losers within this. And then finally, I think it's really interesting, this middle 74% statistic there, of the kind of vast majority of office workers who want training in hybrid working, want to feel more supported in this. And I think importantly, not just from the qualitative comments we had, not just in terms of using IT, because I think typically from the work that we've done, that is where organizations are putting in effort. So understanding how to use meeting room technologies, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, those kind of things. But actually how we navigate the world of hybrid. So how we coordinate with others, how actually we plan our weeks, how we plan as work groups. And I think interestingly, this number would have gone up, but a year ago, we were looking at 9% of workers, given we're a few years into this, who'd actually received any training in hybrid. So I think there's a huge gap there, but also a massive opportunity in terms of how we support colleagues in this journey. So that's context. Okay, so hybrid working, we know it's mainstream, but the experience differs, the arrangement changes. That might be problematic depending on how that arrangement is organized and whether that's actually kind of coordinated within a team. But one of the things we were really interested in was looking at let's really look at what's happening when people are in offices or they're at home. What happens? How do they experience work when they're in different physical settings? So you've got all sorts of assumptions being made around whether the office is important, people are very vested in this, what the experience is like compared to home. So we wanted to try and gather some really good data around this. So we used our diary method to do this across a number of case study organizations we were working with, had data around the offices, 350 or so employees who were taking part. They were reporting to us twice a day using a quantitative survey around where they'd been, how they spent their time, what spaces were in, and how they felt. So across the piece, we've got around 10,000 or so data points on this. So a really decent, rich data set. And I think it's interesting what we found then. So is time in the office beneficial? Well, actually, our data shows that it is. And that might be slightly surprising given a lot of the surveys that we see of home workers and where people self-report, maybe one-time report about how they feel overall working at home, maybe versus the office. So these diaries were asking people to report in the moment. So when they were at home, when they were sat in the office, when they were sat maybe at a client site or in a coffee shop, what have you been doing? Where have you been spending your time? How do you feel? And when you ask them in the moment, and you compare for the same people over time, we find that when people were reporting in the office, they were typically reporting high levels of job satisfaction, self-rated performance, engagement, helping colleagues more often, and experiencing lower levels of work-family conflict. So actually having those physical boundaries was beneficial. Now, I think that's really interesting because often we don't have a particularly positive narrative to tell around why spending time in the office might be personally beneficial, but it is as well as for the firm. Now, I'm not saying that's a universally positive experience, and certainly not that forcing people to spend 5 days per week in the office is going to get the best results. And indeed, our data didn't show any kind of clear sweet spot for what the optimum number of days in the office. What our data was showing was it's really individual, really personal. And I think that's a real challenge for organizations, that there aren't easy heuristics, I think, in terms of spotting groups of workers who may necessarily want or benefit most from fully office working, fully home working. So we didn't find clear trends in terms of people with children or age or seniority and so on, much more kind of individual. And I think what we're seeing then as we go forwards, the trends that we had in office design before the pandemic have been turbocharged. So if you think about the Google offices, people typically think about, and the slides they might have in the office and the wacky areas and so on. We've seen a general trend pre-pandemic towards what we call activity-based working. So lots of different task bases, reduction in individual workstations, designing in more collaborative space, project space, quiet areas, and so on. And as the industry data shows, that's really been turbocharged post-pandemic. But people have been making assumptions about what workers will need when hybrid working and what the optimum mix of space might be. So one of the other questions we're really interested in is, well, actually, what spaces do people use when they're hybrid working, when they're in the office? How does that compare in terms of what they're doing in those spaces as well? So we're gathering data around this. It's from a partner law firm in Leeds. They opened very luckily for them before the pandemic a new office space. It gives them a lot of these kind of areas that we might picture when we think about modern contemporary offices: lounge areas, social spaces, quiet spaces, and increasingly tech-enabled spaces. So we thought, well, can we use our diary data then to really look at, well, this assumption that when people are in the office, if they're hybrid workers, they're going to want to just use that space primarily for collaboration, cut down on the desk space, increase collaboration, really think about organizing that day around social activities. So we took stock, had a look at the data that we had across these 10,000 diary entries. And it's really interesting. So we classified the tasks that people said they've been working on in that previous kind of 4-hour block. And what we found was 40% of the activities people have been engaged in were individual, high concentration tasks. So that could be really working through a problem, doing a design task, kind of writing a management report, those types of activities. 20% solo, low concentration. So that might be dealing with admin, doing email tasks, and so on. Only 20% of the activities were face-to-face interaction. That could be in one-to-one or large group. 11% video calls, 5% written communications, typically email, 2.5% hybrid meetings. So that's thinking about kind of where they were in person with others remote. That's probably gone up since we gathered this data. And 1.6% of the activities were still voice calls. There's still a few people with a physical landline or a mobile phone they were using. That is a really low figure. But what it's certainly showing is that individual activity is by far the largest in terms of the activities that people are undertaking in the office. And it's interesting comparing that then to the data we gathered when people were working at home. Well, it's remarkably similar. So 6% of the tasks at home were solo. That's probably not surprising. Again, I think the assumptions we have is that much more work at home is individual. 25% video calls, 2% face-to-face interactions. They're likely people who live with others, who are working with, or who are going off locally to meet others, and 1.5% hybrid meetings they participated in. But I think it's interesting. That does challenge, I think, a bit some of the design assumptions, some of the the big steps that some organizations have been taking around downsizing office space. And again, I think there's a risk if we assume that people's need for individual task-focused space is reduced under hybrid working, that they don't value kind of quiet space anymore, and that we don't need to invest in it. But interestingly, having quite a debate, quite a discussion with my engineering colleague on the project, and his kind of view is actually we need to be prioritizing more space for individual desks, but that's more important in the hybrid work office of the future. Think about the size of those spaces as well to give people what they need. So I think it's a really interesting debate to be had, but a need for more data, more personal data, organization and department by department to get that right. Last thing to share around this kind of data. So we're also looking at social networks and what the implications of how often you're in the office, where you sat in the office might do for this. And a couple of quick things to flag. So again, there's an assumption that if you're in the office more frequently, that's going to be positive for your professional networks, for your advancement. So we're still crunching some of this data because of some of the complexity of it. But it's interesting, a few headlines. So the first is actually, yeah, that assumption of if you're in the office more frequently, then you are better connected. You have more connections, you tend to be more central within the professional networks than colleagues who are in less frequently. Now, some of that might be a little bit circular and self-reinforcing, but it does seem to play out in the data that we had. The second thing as well is that where you sit in the office is also influential. We've got some lovely kind of floor plans and network data overlaid that you can really see the patterns that form around the desk areas that people typically sit at, how networks diverge across large offices. Excuse me. But actually more important than that is team membership. So the organizational structure. So regardless of whether you go into the office frequently, where you sit in the office, if you have a need to interact with others, either to share knowledge or to get approvals or to report in, then you will seek out those relationships, those interactions happen anyway. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But that was more influential than physical proximity and location. And then finally, we also have, I think, an assumption that if you're new, you need to be in the office a lot, and that's going to benefit you. Again, our data looking at people who joined the organizations we were studying more recently or through the study, actually office attendance wasn't or doesn't seem to be important in how connected they are or how central they are. What seems to be more important is who they're in with for that to occur. So this idea of purposeful presence is much more important. There's no point in being in every day if you're in a vacuum, if the more senior colleagues aren't in, because all you're doing is connecting with the same few people or the same few junior colleagues. So I think it's a real interesting challenge back there to organizations around how we support, how we create the interactions and the opportunities to support new starters. The assumption that you just ask people to be in frequently is definitely not going to cut it. So we know this is important. If you know anything about the networks, literature, and so on, we know that this in general, but particularly in our data, employees who reported fewer interactions with others were more likely also to say they had less of a sense of belonging. So feeling kind of isolated, also leading into a disconnect from the organization. And that people who were having lots of connections, lots of people reporting into them, were more likely to be considering quitting their job. So again, there's ways maybe of using physical space to protect them, areas of the office maybe which are less frequently, you don't have people passing so often, or you could be selective, I think, in terms of when people come in to protect those kind of key brokers, people who help connect people within a professional network. But we know the impact of those kind of people leaving is really severe, because often there's lots of knowledge they hold that others don't. So there's three implications, I think, that come through from that. And that really is, and we're seeing, again, this being played out in practice, around whether we prioritize team days for departments, for teams. So we do prioritize teams spending time together. So we know that when people are in together, that it does help form those connections. But we know that those teams will do that anyway. Our data shows that. So should we be more purposeful in terms of maybe mixing up teams or departments, try and broker those connections? People typically hate that, but we know that won't happen, and particularly if people are coming in on different days or sitting in very segregated areas of the office. So we allow free choice. I'll come to this in a moment, but we know people like choice when it comes to where they work. But we also know, and again from our data, that reinforces kind of cliques and silos in terms of the choices people make about where they sit, where they can choose to book if you've got booking systems for desks. There's some really interesting innovations coming through in terms of desk booking systems, nudging people to sit in particular areas or ring fencing particular areas for teams and so on. And I think, again, there's an opportunity to be really smart potentially in how we use that in the future workplace. We can craft those networks, be a little bit subtle about shifting those interactions. But there's trade-offs with each of this. And I think that's a really interesting thing when we look at hybrid policies, look at future offices. There is no easy solution to how we design this to suit everybody or to meet all of our objectives. So my kind of take on this would be that, well, designing future workplaces, it's a socio-technical problem, because we can't think about this as a work design problem. So it's just a work arrangement and how we design this, because actually it has impact straight away on the processes we're following in terms of actually how information is shared. The technology absolutely drives what's possible, what interactions can happen, but also maybe in terms of how you access space as well. We know that physical space can kind of influence the experience of hybrid working, what's possible, and so on. And all of this kind of knocks on to goals and cultures as well, and they influence the choice that people make. So we can't look at this in isolation. And I think that's one of my frustrations, looking at some of the work that's been going on in practice, where you have HR developing policy, flexible work policy, hybrid policy, IT is making its own investments, infrastructure facilities are doing their piece, making assumptions around what's needed. And it's really different. And then locally, management decisions being made as well. And none of that being done in isolation is a recipe for success. So I would suggest this is whole system redesign, which is really exciting but really complex, but where we as psychologists, I think, have huge value to add in terms of helping to challenge preconceptions that people have, thinking about the change management that goes through with this, the ergonomics come through, the job design aspects that need to be understood, and so on, for really good design decisions to be made. So our experience and some of the work with organizations we've done suggests that if we think about hybrid working and future workplaces, this is everyone's problem. It's not HR's, it's not facilities, it's not OD on their own, it's organizational design in the biggest sense. And that involves shared decisions. And what we need for those decisions to be taken is the widest set of stakeholders in the room, but also the understanding of the knock-on implications of the decisions we take around the office or the infrastructure will constrain what we can do in terms of a hybrid policy, in terms of the design of the autonomy that individuals have in their work and so on. And all of these have ripple effects. And I would suggest that systems thinking, and in particular socio-technical tools, can help us do that really effectively. We've used scenarios planning. I'll very briefly show, but won't talk through it, as a method for doing this. And you're welcome to have a look at some of the resources we've shared around this. All of this has consequences. Some of that's intended, some of it's unintended. Some of it we can't know until it happens in practice. But some of this we can try to work through and predict. And again, I think there's ways we can do that through workshops, through kind of data gathering, that can really help evidence-based decision making. And the goals we set will influence what we do. And I think often there's conflicting goals within organizations and between departments and services. And that's one of the difficulties I think a lot of the firms that have been struggling to get people back into the office have been facing, where maybe top-level decisions and financial priorities have rubbed up against the goals at the lower level around retaining staff, around kind of project delivery and so on, that has kind of made policy maybe not work in practice, let's say. And then finally, there's more than one solution. And the work that we've been doing has really been highlighting that in terms of the type of office, the type of hybrid work arrangement we design, how we use technology. There's a myriad of ways we could use this. And a lot of the choices we make should be informed about the goals we're trying to satisfy. So is it around flexibility? Is it around cost reduction? How do these start to play out in reality? So we did quite a bit of work with industry workshops, range of stakeholders. They're trying to understand, well, what are the implications of choosing? We're basing a lot of this around different office choices. So going back to more traditional office working, levels of time in the office, different types of fully remote and so on as well, to unpick the system implications. And I'm not going to go through this for time, but there's some step-by-steps in the reports I'll share. But all of it has highlighted the level of connectedness when we're talking about the HR issues, the individual kind of motivations that people have, the knock-on consequences that you can trace through here, and different ways of trying to satisfy that. But I think, and hopefully if you have a look at these, you'll see it's a powerful way of trying to draw this together. But what that work does show is that all of this, so as much as the formalized hybrid policies are important, the individual decisions we choose to make within departments, groups, teams, and so on will have as big a consequence in shaping how people work in reality. And we had lots of examples of this in terms of kind of negative feedback loops and people reporting kind of the empty office when I go in disincentivizes me going in again. Other people finding they're having a really poor experience because the person they need has chosen not to go in. And lots of little examples how this kind of magnifies over time. So we know that there's a need to really think much more, both at the individual level. We spend a lot of time talking about individual preferences, what individuals want from hybrid work, and how do we motivate the individuals. But we also need to think about those kind of group and team requirements as well, because that's really, really involved in this. The friction between me and we, what we as a team need to achieve, how do we get the common ways of working? How do we agree how we're going to deliver things with the me and my personal requirements and needs and so on as well? I think that's a really interesting area of work in terms of supporting, particularly line managers more, in being skilled to have those conversations, manage that conflict. Diverse mental models, shaping what's needed. We're seeing dynamic natures of all of this as well. So actually, how do we design workplaces and policies to deal with the fact that this shifts week to week? And I think what we're seeing much more is that means that rather than downsizing and being quick to do this, we've got to have more slack in the system to accommodate the range of working patterns that will happen through the year. And then the thing that we often, I think, ignore, and I don't think we've been very good yet at dealing with when we think about what do people want from a future office and what's going to affect how I manage people, is really understanding the home environments that people are also working in. So that will massively affect what people can do at home, the requirements they individually have for the office, as well as their work patterns. But we're not sophisticated enough at understanding it. But that's as big a driver around influencing what we need to provide for a safe, productive work environment as somebody's individual preference, or thinking about the bottom line and what we can potentially do without. We can come back to that if we're interested. Right, last thing, we've got a few minutes to go. There's one last thing I wanted to share with you. And I apologize, I know this is a rapid fire run through. But the last thing, I just wanted to highlight what I think is really important, and in particular around autonomy. We talk about this a lot in hybrid working. And I want to just specifically talk about location autonomy for a moment. This is a part of our diary studies we published recently, and it's a bit of a deeper dive in terms of the implication of this location autonomy and the effects that it has. And I think something we can really leverage more in our work. So general question, does control over where you work matter? As psychologists, I think we'd innately say yes, control generally is really important, absolutely. But it's interesting looking specifically at that sense of control over where you work. So we term that location autonomy. It's been around for a few years now. People have been starting to look at this just before the pandemic, but it's really starting to grow in terms of what the effects are. So using our diary approach, we're looking at, well, how does that influence task environment fit? So how that kind of fits together. So the work tasks, the physical environment, and then the knock-on consequences. So we know task environment fit is important, but how does the location autonomy start to influence this. So we'd expect that if people are hybrid working, if they have much more diverse kind of modern offices, variety of spaces to fit the task, then that should be positive, should improve fit, that should improve outcomes. But hybrid plus these environments. So it was 6 organizations. This study was looking over 10 days, people reporting twice a day, 316 employees, over 4,000 half-day sessions that people were doing, reporting on their location autonomy, so how much control had you had over choosing where to work in the last few hours. So that could be really micro in terms of the areas within an office or at home and so on. Level of fit, task absorption, task proficiency, so that's performance, job satisfaction and well-being. And there's a whole series of really complex multi-level modeling, which is beyond me, but fortunately my much more advanced colleagues were able to run for us. And what this shows is that choice really does matter, and the data is really strong in showing this, that where kind of participants reported choice over where to work, they experienced higher fit, you'd expect that, but that predicted higher levels of absorption, task proficiency, job sat, and lower well-being, mental distress well-being. So universally positive. Okay, so that task environment fit, getting the space to fit the task, but the role of that location autonomy, really important here. And that location autonomy in particular can help improve that fit. Also work method autonomy that we know about, choosing how and control over how we do our work. And we'd suggest actually that's really good because it can be used to compensate for lack of autonomy elsewhere. So we've got lots of jobs and roles, so it might be quite difficult to let people adjust how things are done, okay, or the timing of this and so on. But actually the location autonomy, giving people the opportunity to move around a work site or a building, or to choose in terms of hybrid working, whether to work from home or other locations, that can compensate, can be really powerful. And that location autonomy is distinct, so it's different to decision-making, work method autonomy, and others as well. So we can use it to compensate, as we were saying. But also things like physical comfort were also important in terms of fit. And increasingly, this comes up a lot in our interview work. It seems to be under hybrid working that people are much more focused on work planning, work organization, and that sense of accomplishment by completing planned tasks. And that's just something that's been coming through. It's really interesting. Maybe actually the way we approach work is changing under this way of working as well. Whew. Okay, so that's 42 minutes, I think, 43 minutes run through. There's lots more beside this, but these are headlines I thought would be interesting to share. What are the reflections overall? So 4 key things to pull out. First one is just to challenge the expectation that hybrid working is always necessarily empowering. So our interview data, survey data and others suggest it's not always the case. There's different hybrid arrangements. So whether you're kind of a free hybrid or a fixed hybrid, your kind of experience of hybrid working could be radically different. And employees, even within the same work teams, can have really different mental models of what hybrid is. And that's problematic. I think this is a classic socio-technical design challenge. So think about how technology interacts with the social processes and organizational design. And this sense of individual autonomy, individual choice we have, rubs up against team organizational design, the technology, what that permits, the spaces we're providing. So we have to think about this as a holistic problem. So psychologists, we need to be working with engineers, estates, HR, with others as well, technology. And we've got the opportunity then to utilize location autonomy. We can lean into this, we can leverage it. It can be something that can compensate for other things. It can be a real kind of powerful benefit to hybrid working, to investing in different types of office space. And then finally, just a question to ask whether we've really trained and upskilled, whether we've recognized the shift enough that we've had with hybrid working. And I think it's a huge opportunity for us as a profession, others in HR as well. But we can see more and more that hybrid working is qualitatively different from full-time office working, from fully remote working. The management practices that are required, I think, for success are different. The experiences are different. The needs in terms of coordination and so on are different as well. Just question how much we've actually really supported either employees or frontline line managers in terms of making that shift. So I think it's exciting. We're still doing work on this, but there's lots of things. If you're interested, we've got two interactive reports, interactive PDFs you can download from our website. There's podcasts, there's videos, there's other content, infographics and things up there as well. But the reports are free to use, lots of things in there, lots more detail. And the paper, the diary study we still published is available now. There's a free version that should pop up in Google. If not, drop me a note and I can send that across as well. So with that, thank you very much. Be really delighted if people have questions, comments, things that they'd like to share in discussion. We've got 11 minutes. We can go a little bit longer if there's other things that people want to talk about. But I'd like to leave it there if I can do. I'll try and stop sharing the screen so I can bring everybody out in larger picture. Hang on. There we go.
Hi, Matthew.
Hi, Lucy.
Question, if I can.
Yeah, of course. So my screen's all rearranged now. I got very confused about where people were. Go ahead, Lucy.
So I specialise in change and transformation in local government, and did a lot of work during the pandemic about how our organisations are managing to make change happen. And obviously hybrid working is a massive change that happened. I've been asked by a client to run a facilitation with their middle managers, because what they're finding is they're not wanting to set a fixed rule. So a lot of councils are saying you've got to be in 3 days a week, 2 days a week. They're putting some rules around it. This particular council doesn't want to put those rules around. What they want is to run a session with their middle managers to skill them up in navigating some of these tensions, which you described, because there is a lot for managers to think about when they're thinking about how do I want to run my team. And I just wondered if you had any advice, or if there's anything particular you think I should pull from your research to get them thinking about, I'm trying to increase the maturity and I don't want them to bring their own baggage, because I see this is an area where everybody has their own personal view, probably based on their personal preferences and their personal lifestyle, as to how they think it should work. And I'm trying to dismantle some of that and get them to think a little bit wider. I just wondered if there's anything in particular you think I should cover.
Absolutely. I think it's a really interesting piece of work. So good luck with that, because I think that's going to be one that I would imagine will run for a little while. And we've worked a bit with local government and central government, a couple of our partner organisations in this. So I can recognise some of the challenges you're probably seeing. I'd say the first thing I think is kind of trying to help people take a step back, I think, from that personal experience. So thinking around equity, that comes through a lot in terms of both our qualitative and quantitative data with employees around what they find most frustrating, what they prize. So that sense of being treated fairly, the rules and the expectations are similar across organizations. Now, that will need to vary by teams and others and so on, but it's having some common principles that run through and making sure they're consistent, I think, in terms of how those are role modeled. But then the other part of that, I think, as well is, I think, starting from an activity point of view. So thinking about actually, what is it that there's a real case for saying that these need to be done in person, or where there's value added from spending time together, and working through from that way, because it depersonalizes, I think, some of the decisions there, and it sets out that logic. So why the biggest question I think see coming through from this and reported from line managers is, how do I answer that? Well, why should I? No, why should I come in? Why should I take that cost of the commute? And I think starting from the standpoint of, well, actually, what is the value of bringing people together? And some of that might be really obvious, and there may be some activities which can't be done in other ways. But I think it's also being clear around, well, there are certain things we prioritize, and it is a level of team time, protected team time. It's a level of connection with the building because of X, Y, Z. But it's being really clear on that up front. And I think spending a bit of time around, well, how do I explain back the individual benefits? So I think our data is quite useful in some ways for that positive narrative. So the diary data kind of shows that actually, well, spending time in the office can be a positive experience, better for well-being, kind of increased satisfaction and so on, helping colleagues. Those are good things, you know. And equally, within the report, just it was sort of writing up, doing a bit more analysis on the personality side. Again, people assume that introverts can be disadvantaged by going into the office. It's uncomfortable. But again, our data looking at personality traits and states was showing actually the benefits to people further on the introverted side of the dimension were showing kind of in the day when they're in the office actually has a positive effect on their try and get the terminology right, because I'm not a personality psychologist, but the state, the personality state, and some of the behaviours that were coming through. So again, I think there's positives there from putting people in maybe less kind of preferential situations as well. But I think starting from what can we explain and articulate in a fair way, and I think often the activity, and then really being really clear on the objectives. What do we look to achieve from the time in the office? And if you start with that, I think it takes a lot of the difficulty out of the conversation.
Yeah.
But then it's thinking about actually, well, within that, then there's actually lots of scope for a team to design rules themselves. So what are the norms we want to have? So how many days notice do we give each other before an in-person meeting? What's fair to expect? What level of kind of consistency as a team do we expect around week to week kind of work patterns? Those kind of, we can think about it as coming up with, I guess, those team charters and so on. That what are the overarching principles for the organization? What are the activities that we say as an organization are non-negotiable, and the objectives? And the service or the group level, okay, what are the activities and priorities we have? And then, as much as we can, what can we empower those groups and so on to design themselves within those parameters? And again, it stops it being seen as such an imposition.
Yeah.
So that's a very long answer, but
helpful. Thank you very much.
But I haven't seen anybody who's cracked it, and anybody who's done it without some of the friction and the upset, because it challenges, I think, the expectations that people have built up, and particularly where they haven't been particularly challenged over the past few years. People design ways of working through the pandemic that have perpetuated, and that level of inconsistency is difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is really personal. I did a piece of research interviewing council chief execs about what change happened during the pandemic, and even though it wasn't about hybrid working, it was about approach to change management. What I really noticed was they all drew on their personal experience and were saying, I have no problem working from home. I don't understand why other people want to come in the office, or I think it's really important to be in the office, so we should be in the office. It's so personally driven.
Absolutely.
And I don't think people have self-awareness around that. So that's my first step, is to try and bring some self-awareness around that, I think.
And I think we had it. So I think our snapshot survey, so we're looking across industries. That was interesting. We did a little bit. There's some questions in there around what would pull you to spend more time in the office, those kind of things as well. And it was interesting. Those pro-social aspects were the ones that were the biggest draws. So supporting new starters, supporting colleagues who are struggling. So I think there's, again, ways of, I think, leaning into that thing around actually supporting each other. It's making sure we're looking after each other's kind of well-being and so on, that actually people respond quite well to. And I think when it's personalized in that way, it has a stronger draw as well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Matthew, you mentioned that there weren't really a huge amount of differences that came out for some of your research in relation to age. Was there anything that was generationally different? Because even just some of the conversations that I've had, I've found that those that are newer into the workplace, perhaps living in flat shares, their workplace is next to their bed and they don't feel that they're getting, even fresh air. Whereas people who have perhaps owned their own homes, they've invested in a lovely shed in the garden that is actually a really nice place to go to. There was real differences from them in terms of wanting to be in the office versus wanting to be at home. Did the research say anything?
So it didn't, from memory, in terms of across the different data, it didn't fall out that neatly. So the factors you described, absolutely really influential. So the type of home environment people have, the social support and so on, career stage, but that doesn't necessarily pass out really neatly in terms of generation, because actually, and particularly for some of the younger workers who maybe are still living at home where they are in large properties versus those who are flat sharing, but for some of those, actually, that's a really comfortable position to be in. Others, obviously, it's a push in, and it was so, for us, it was so individually. There's so many, I guess, interactions there. in terms of unpicking that meaningfully without a national level kind of data set is quite difficult. So I think some of the really large surveys that were run around home working did a better job of that, because they were looking at 10,000 or so on respondents. Our largest data set was around 1,000 for the cross survey. So you saw some of it, but it was much more around home situation, dependence, those kind of factors. But again, it differed, and then the individual preference differed. So you might have two people who, for one, having children actually meant that the flexibility of being at home predominantly was much more valuable, despite the distraction, for somebody else who was desperate to get into the office to be away from that. So I think that level of individuality is a bit that I think is most problematic, because I think it's really difficult to make the kind of inferences that would help us with general design principles or support packages. So I think the requirement on line managers becomes greater to have the individual conversations, because they can't make assumptions, I think, in that kind of way.
But I suppose that's where the challenge lies, isn't it? And in some of the leadership work programs that I've been delivering, we have conversations about hybrid working, and these leaders want answers as to what can I do for these individuals. And there's obviously an element of being able to draw an organisational policy, but also needing to read the grey areas within that and aligning it to individuals. And we've had the conversation, as you mentioned, about fairness, but obviously that as a concept means something quite different to different people.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is where the principles come in, but I think it's difficult. I haven't seen anybody who's got a perfect answer to this, because I think you end up disenfranchising or kind of closing down options for one group or the other as this goes through. So I think it has to come back to what are we trying to achieve? So in terms of the level of office attendance we expect, whether that's higher or lower, is there a justifiable reason why there's a minimum requirement that I have? And if so, that's fine. That's a performance issue, isn't it, in terms of why we require it, or where you have to find reasonable adjustments. But I think where we can't argue that, then I think, again, the fairness thing becomes really difficult to stand behind. But I think often my frustration is that there's a decision that's made, I think, at a top level that this is the number of days that I think is important, or this is a reason why we're going to have X percentage of space or attendance, or what have you. And the connection back to either outcomes or other data to explain where that's come from is quite weak. And instantly you're on back foot in that sense. You can see that with some of the banks and the others who are struggling at the moment. So not a useful answer to you, Tracy. I apologize for that. But yeah, I think the complexity we were talking about there was important.
Matthew, can I ask
Hi, John.
a quick question?
Yeah.
Firstly, thanks very much. It was really interesting. So a lot of the work that I do is focused on building a culture of inclusion. And when I'm talking about this with managers, leaders in organizations, one of the things they express concern over is how they can establish a good sense of inclusion, a good culture of inclusion, particularly between individuals who might spend a lot of time at home versus those individuals that might spend a lot of time in the office. Big question, but does the work that you've done, you alluded to it a little bit earlier when you talked about belonging, for example, but does your research or your your insights offer any views on that?
Yeah, so I think so this is more, I guess, my personal reflection on what we've got, and again looking at other emerging data around this. So so I think there's a risk there, I think, in terms of having people who aren't engaged. I think whether it's people who are, because you can spend a lot of time in the office but not be engaged, not be kind of connected to those around you, but obviously I guess more likely if you're fully remote. I think our data does suggest that you've got a greater chance of being on periphery if you're not in very often. But on the flip side of that, I think if you look at some of the firms who pre-pandemic were fully remote, they were pretty sophisticated at finding ways of building relationships between fully remote, maybe really globally diverse distributed teams, because they had to. They put the effort into it. I think where we carry the risk, I think, with hybrid working, is that we rely on a lot of the old, I guess, techniques we had where the office just did that work for us. By being present, people bumped into each other, you could have the events. And I think that's probably one area where there's a weakness. We haven't really thought, well, the stuff we did as kind of emergency measures through the pandemic, we had our Zoom quizzes and the daily check-ins and so on. Well, we let those go when the offices reopened. But actually, if we are allowing people to have a high percentage of time remotely, then I think there's a duty of care to make sure that we still invest in that. And we make sure that actually things like, I think if you have anchor days or team events through the month, what have you, to bring those groups together, do we make sure those are mandatory and I think not apologize for the fact that we see those as important for ensuring that people do have the connections they need, both to perform their job, but also so they're not being excluded from opportunities. Training events are a good way of doing this as well, that may be a little bit gentler. But I think that duty care and that well-being angle actually should give us a cover to say, well, no, this is important. We want you to come to this. But then to think, actually, are there digital tools that we could use from those kind of virtual teams that would help here? And again, I think being bold enough to say that we expect everybody to engage with those. So it's not just the echo chamber for those few maybe who are fully remote. But yeah, I think it's difficult. I think the other thing with things like neurodiversity and others where people are almost kind of self-selecting themselves out of the office because they feel it's not going to be a supportive environment. I think, again, the design trend we're seeing in terms of the greater, more flexible offices, more kind of task-based and so on, actually, again, that gives us an opportunity to design in quiet spaces. We're seeing quiet work rooms that firms are putting in that actually, if you need to be in isolation, well, in quiet, well, that's a sensory deprived room that you can go and work in with others who are willing to work in that way as well. So I think we can make adjustments that make it a more comfortable experience as well.
Yeah, thank you.
But it's fascinating. I can say if you see evidence of good practice on this, I'd love to see it as you go through, because I think, again, everybody's feeling their way.
Yeah, I think so. I think something you mentioned earlier on, I'm certainly picking up is just this general concept of what hybrid means and how they define it, quantify it. People are scrabbling around in the dark trying to find something to grab hold of.
And I think that's particularly when it comes to think about kind of job offers, negotiation and so on. I think, again, that's a point to be really clear about for our organization. This is the expectation. And again, I think sometimes that's being left deliberately ambiguous to help with recruitment. And all it's doing is causing problems on week 2, week 3, where that starts to play out.
Thank you.
No worries. Now, I'm conscious of time, and we've gone over, and I don't want to keep people on a Thursday evening where you might have pub plans or other things. But were there any last questions before we close for the evening? I can see in the chat that people have been dropping off and so on as well. No, wonderful. Okay, well, I know we're going to circulate the slide deck afterwards. The web address that's in the slides, or if you Google me, there'll be a web link to follow, futureworkplace.leeds.ac.uk. All the reports, all the information, the other bits are up on there. So do feel free to have a look around on those. If you're interested, get in touch as well. If you're passing Leeds at any point, do come in and see us. Always a pleasure to have more psychologists in the building. So do come and drop us a line. But it's been lovely. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.